I'm starting a new sourdough starter. I've never had one work, so let's see if it works this time. Counter cooking. No kitchen, no problem. So this is like the third or fourth time now that I'm trying to make a sourdough starter that actually works. The last one that I tried to make, it got really moldy and I had to throw it out. And then prior to that, I never had any luck with the sourdough starters actually becoming active or rising or anything like that. So I found a YouTube channel called Sourdough Journey, and the content on that channel is phenomenal. And I've been watching a lot of the videos and learning a lot. And I really like how he's kind of busting the lies and the myths about sourdough starters that are all over the internet. And he gives a method of making a sourdough starter that's completely different from the methods that I've tried so far. And he explains everything and it all makes perfect sense. So that's why I'm going to try it now. So what I have in here in this mason jar is a mixture of all-purpose flour and whole wheat flour. He says you have to use 50% whole wheat flour. I want to make an einkorn sourdough starter because I want to make einkorn sourdough bread. And he doesn't actually recommend using einkorn flour, but that's what I want to use. So that's what I have in this jar. I have 50% einkorn all-purpose flour and 50% einkorn whole wheat flour. The next thing I need to do is measure out 75 grams of this flour. I'm going to use this mason jar, and 75 grams of water. So I'm going to make 75 grams of this flour and 75 grams of water in this mason jar, and that's going to be the very beginning of this starter. So I have 75 grams of flour, and I'm using bottled spring water. So I'm going to add 75 grams of water, and now I'm going to mix it together. This is what it looks like. It's a very, very thick batter. And he said the way to test it is to turn it upside down and it should remain in the jar. I'm kind of afraid to do this, but there we go. I turned it upside down and nothing is dripping out, so this seems to be the correct consistency. And now what I need to do is put a cover on it. And he says you want to use a solid cover. You don't want to use a cloth cover or anything like that because the yeasts exist already in the flour. We're not pulling yeasts out of the air, which is information that's all over the internet. And what you want to do is you want to put the cover on and then just like loosen it slightly. So I just gave it like a quarter of a turn. So that way it's a little bit loose, air can get in and out, but we're not getting anything like falling into the top, or we're not getting any like mold spores or other kind of bacteria particles from the air that could fall in through cloth, for example. And so this is it. The next thing is to put it in a cool, dark place for 2 to 3 days. I think he recommends like 3 days. So that, again, that's something different. So now I need to find a place that's going to be cool. I just put it on a low shelf in my pantry, and I'll be checking it every 24 hours, but I won't be feeding it at all. So we'll see what happens. It's been about 27 hours now, and I forgot to look at this after 24 hours, but I figure we're close enough. So this is what's going on in the jar. This is what it looks like. It has actually risen a little bit. I don't know if you could notice this, but like here, it's darker around the top, and then like this is the real, this was the like originating line. And I don't know if you could also notice, but there's all kinds of little bubbles in the mixture. So I think it might be starting like what's known as the false rise, like, you know, within the first few days when you have the war going on between the yeast that we want and all of the other bacteria and stuff that's in here. They have to kind of battle it out. So right now where this was located, it was about 67 degrees. And I actually moved it. So I have this in a closed cooler with a little ice pack in it, and it's been keeping the temperature in it around 67 degrees. Right now it's like the hottest part of the day. It's also near an air conditioning vent, so that's helping to keep it cool. This morning when I checked it, it was around 77 degrees, so it was a little bit warmer in there. So I'm just trying to keep it lower than room temperature, because right now room temperature is about 80 degrees. After we get through the first 3 days, then room temperature should be fine. but the goal is to keep it cooler for the first 3 days. And also with this method, I don't feed it for the first 3 days. So I'm gonna put this back in the cooler and I'm gonna check on it again tomorrow. This is day 3 for the sourdough starter. And the first thing that I noticed when I took it out is it seems that it rose all the way to the top of the jar and then came back down because there are streaks all along the sides of the jar. And this is what's going on inside. It's like really frothy and liquidy. According to the instructions I'm following, you're not supposed to feed it until day 4. Although the starter that was shown as an example does not look like this at all. Like it looked very different than this. It was much thicker. So I don't know, I'm gonna smell this. Wow, this smells like vinegar. This really smells like vinegar. I've never had a starter smell this much like vinegar before. So the instructions were to just cover this and let it sit another day before feeding. So that's what I'm gonna do. Today is day 4 for the sourdough starter, and look at what's going on here. Do you see this? I think this is hooch. I think that's what's on top of this. And yeah, I mean, this just like all liquid on there. So today is the day that I need to feed this, and the plan is to save 25 grams of the starter and then feed it with 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. So the first thing we're going to do is pour off this liquid. So there's all the hooch and some of the starter, and then the rest of the starter is here in the jar. So I'm going to get a clean jar. I just added 25 grams of starter to a clean jar, and now I'm going to add 50 grams of water. There's 50 grams of water. I'm going to stir that in to dilute the starter that was in there. Now I'm going to add 50 grams of flour. There's 50 grams of flour. And I'm going to stir this all together. It should make a thick batter. The mixture is now the consistency of a really thick batter. It's not sticky at all. So now I get to just leave it out and see if it rises, and then check on it in about 24 hours, I guess. I'm gonna take a spatula and push down the sides so it'll be easier to see if it's rising. I just put a rubber band around it, and I'm gonna put the lid back on, tighten it, and then turn it about a quarter of a turn the opposite direction. And now I can leave this on the counter. So I'm just gonna put it aside and we'll see what it does. It is day 5 for the sourdough starter. And this is what's going on. Can you see that? So there's the liquid on top of it. Now, from what I learned yesterday, it's not actually hooch, because you don't get hooch until you have a fully formed sourdough starter. So at this point, it's just like water separation. The smell has changed from vinegar smell to just nasty smell. It smells pretty pungent and nasty. So I'm going to pour off the liquid, and I'm going to measure out 25 grams of starter into a fresh jar, and then I'm going to feed it 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. There's the starter. It's actually 26 grams. I think that's close enough. Now let's add the water. I'm at 50.5. Now let's add the flour. I'm going to do 51 grams of flour. Here's my starter after it was fed. I put a rubber band along the level where it's at, and it looks good. It is the consistency of a very thick batter. If I turn it upside down, it does not fall out. So I think we're good. I'm going to put the cap back on. And I'll put this aside for another 24 hours. Now I should mention the starter did not do anything since yesterday. Like, it did not rise at all. So I don't know if this one's gonna rise or if it's not gonna rise. We'll see what happens. Supposedly we're in the quiet phase. So we've gone from the initial phase through the false rise, and now we are in a few days of quiet stage. So we'll see if that's true. It's been a little bit more than 24 hours. I totally forgot about the starter. This is what it looks like. So it's mostly flat, and there are some bubbles in it, and it's really not doing anything. It didn't rise or anything. It still has a pretty pungent smell, so I am going to feed this. I'm going to take out 25 grams of the starter, mix it with 50 grams of flour, 50 grams of water, and then we're good for another day. Here's my starter after it was fed. I ended up adding a little bit extra flour because it was still really liquidy after I added 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. I don't know why, because I only used 25 grams of starter. So, we'll see what happens. It has been 8 days for the sourdough starter. I did not feed it yesterday because it hasn't been doing anything. And I was looking at the instructions that I'm following again, and I printed out the written instructions, which actually include more information versus the instructional videos. And the written instructions say that if you're not seeing enough bubbles, then don't feed it. It said if you're not seeing more bubbles today than the previous day, then wait a while, wait 12 hours, wait 24 hours and see if you notice more bubbles. So because it hadn't been doing anything and there really weren't many bubbles, I decided to wait an extra day, and this is what it looks like now. There's actually very small bubbles in it, and so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed it one more time, and then if it doesn't do anything overnight or for the next 48 hours, then I might do what they call a stall test, just to see what's going on with this. But I do have to say that the aroma has changed again, because right now, today, this smells yeasty. It smells like beer. It definitely has a yeasty beer-like aroma, which is completely different from that really pungent, nasty smell that it has had over the past few days. So I am going to measure out 25 grams of this and then feed it as I've been feeding it. I just fed the starter. I kept 25 grams of what was left in the jar, and I added 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. But that was a little too wet, so I ended up adding just a little bit more flour. I just wanted to add a little bit more so that if I turn it upside down, it doesn't fall out or move or anything. I wanted that same consistency. Then I put a rubber band around the bottom to mark where the level of the starter is, and then I put another rubber band up here, and I want to mark where the current marks on this jar are as far as starter on the sides, so that way if it happens to rise and if it goes above here, then I'll know for sure that the marks above here were from when it rose versus are those marks from when I cleaned off the sides of the jar, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to put the lid on and put this aside. Here's what I'm discarding. Something that I noticed was once I started taking the 25 grams out, then the rest of the starter, underneath the surface, didn't smell as yeasty. It kind of had more of that stinky, pungent smell. It's about 18 hours after I last fed this starter, and the level of the starter is actually a little bit above the rubber band. So I'm wondering if it is actually in the process of rising, or did it rise a little and it's coming down? I don't know, but to me that looks like a good indication. And it's all the way around the jar. But there are almost no bubbles on the surface. However, on the side, I do see little bubbles. So I don't know what's going on with this. I'm definitely going to let this continue to just sit here. I'll check it again at 24 hours, and I might just let it continue to set until tomorrow. It's back to having a yeasty smell. Today's actually day 10 for this sourdough starter, and it did grow a little bit from the last time that I fed it. The last time I fed it, it was at the level of this rubber band. And I don't know if you could see around the edge, there's this other line here. So it actually rose about 1/2 of an inch, which to me that's a good sign because we do want it to start rising. I feel like it's progressing a little bit slower than it should be, only because I messed up on the few days where it wasn't doing anything. I should not have been feeding it every 24 hours, and that was my mistake. I should have did a little bit more research and downloaded the printed guide versus just going by what was in the videos as far as the instructions that I'm following. So what I'm trying to do now is strengthen it back up. So the last time I fed this was a little more than 36 hours ago, and then previous to that was about 48 hours. So I'm definitely on a longer cycle than 24 hours because I'm waiting for it to form more bubbles and to rise a little bit before I feed it again. So considering the fact that it did rise and it did settle back down, and it does look like there are quite a bit of bubbles. I don't know if you can see all the bubbles around there. There's lots of small bubbles in the starter. I think I'm gonna feed it now. And this is what the top looks like. There's some darkening on the top. I'm hoping that is not mold. It doesn't look like the mold that I had in the past. Also, when I smell this, it smells like apples. I've never had a sourdough starter that smelled like apples before. It almost smells like fresh apple cider. I'm hoping that what I'm seeing on the top is just some starter that has dried out. So the top is coming off like a skin, so I think that's what's going on with that. I don't think it's mold. And there's quite a few bubbles underneath it. Here's my starter after I fed it, and I tried to be really exact with the rubber band around the level of the starter. And this is what it looks like. I actually had to add an extra 5 grams of flour to make it a consistency so I could like turn it over and it's not going to pour out. And that's the consistency that I've been going for. And I'm using einkorn flour, half whole wheat and half all-purpose. So I'm going to cover this and we'll see what happens. I feel like it should rise again. Maybe it'll rise more. Maybe it will rise faster. We'll have to see. This is the discard. There's actually quite a lot of bubbles in here, and it's kind of almost like a frothy consistency again. Like it's very light and not dense, if that makes any sense. So that's why I'm very hopeful for getting a better rise out of today's feeding. It's about 24 hours since the last time that I fed the starter, and it is still in the process of rising. Maybe it has peaked. To me, it looks like maybe it did peak, I don't know, maybe half an inch higher than it is right now. So I don't want to feed it yet. If it continues to come down, then I'll probably feed it later today, which would be like a 36-hour feeding. Because it does look like this had peaked a little bit earlier, now it's coming down. So that's what I'm doing. So over the past 24 hours, it looked like it did rise more than it rose previously, and it did rise faster than it did previously because we're at like 24 hours now versus I think the last time it was like 36 or 48. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction. And there's a lot more bubbles. There's a whole bunch of bubbles here. This is what it looks like inside. There's definitely more bubbles on the surface than there was previously. It's been about 29 hours since I fed this starter, and it is no longer rising. In fact, it is deflating right now. So I think it's a good time to feed it again. So it appears that it rose to this height, and right now it's down here. I don't know if you could see that. So it rose to around here, and it's deflating. I might keep it in this jar and use a wine glass marker to mark off the level, so that way I'd be able to easily see if it's rising higher than the previous day. I just took this gold wine glass marker and I marked around this mason jar to the level where this rose. Now I know this mason jar weighs 285 grams. I just weighed similar mason jars and they all weigh 285 grams. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to empty out the starter until I get to 310 grams, and then I'll know I have 25 grams of starter left. It's about 6 p.m. right now, and I just fed the starter. I added 50 grams of water and 55 grams of the einkorn flour mixture. That seems to be working well. And I put the rubber band back on the jar, and I'm going to be interested to see how long it's going to take to rise, and will it rise above the marked line from the previous day. So 6 p.m. tomorrow will be 24 hours. And right now I just fed it at about 29 hours. It's about 8 a.m., which is about 14 hours later from when I fed this around 6 p.m. last night. And it appears that it has risen a little bit above the gold line. So here's the gold line, and it looks like it rose maybe a 1/4 inch above the gold line. And it does appear that it's starting to kind of come back down. If we turn it around to this side, we could see it looks like it rose a little bit above the gold line, and now it's starting to recede down below it. It's been 14 hours, so we're definitely making progress because it took a lot longer for it to do that previously. I'm going to let this settle down for another 4 hours or so. I'm going to check it around noon, see what it looks like. Maybe I'll feed it then, maybe not. Maybe I'll wait the full 24 hours until 6 p.m. It's 10:30 a.m. I decided I'm going to let this starter go a full 24 hours before feeding it. This is what it looks like. There's a lot of bubbles. I just smelled it. It smells exactly like nail polish remover. I've never had sourdough starter smell so much like nail polish remover. It's really crazy how the smell keeps changing on the starter. It's about 10 p.m. so it's been 28 hours since I fed this sourdough starter, and it continues to fall very slowly, and it definitely smells like nail polish remover. Like, I'm shocked at how much it smells like nail polish remover. So I have a fresh jar here. I'm going to measure out 25 grams, and then I'm going to feed it, and we'll see what it does overnight and what it looks like tomorrow morning. It's 8:30 a.m., so it's a little bit more than 10 hours later, and this is what's going on with the sourdough starter. It has definitely doubled in size, which is good. So it appears that it is rising higher each time it is fed, but it's still taking a long time to rise. It's a very slow rise. And I don't even know if it has peaked out yet. Like, it definitely has not started to fall yet. So I'm going to see if it continues to rise higher or what it does. So this was fed at 6 p.m. last night, still very early in the day, and I'll be curious to see what happens. It's been a little bit more than 24 hours, and this is the sourdough starter. It has not completely fallen to the rubber band level yet. That's where it started at. And I'm thinking I might feed it right now. It has a very strong smell of nail polish remover, and this is what it looks like. There's some bubbles on top, and there were a lot of bubbles on the side, so I think I'm going to feed it now. I've been doing the 1-2-2 feeding ratio, which is 1 part starter and then 2 parts flour, 2 parts water, and I've been doing 25 grams starter, 50 grams flour, and 50 grams of water. And I think that's too much because it's taking longer than 24 hours to rise and then fall back to its starting level. So I don't know if I should cut down what I'm adding to it. Like, instead of doing 50 grams, maybe add 40. Maybe I'll try that and see how that goes. It is midnight. I just fed the starter. I added 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water, so that's a little bit less food than I've been feeding it. So I am going to be curious to see how it does. I marked the level with a rubber band. It is now 8 hours later, and this is the sourdough starter. So it's doubled in size in 8 hours. I'm going to mark the jar where the level of the rise is right now. So I'll be interested to see if it continues to rise or if it starts to fall. It's almost 24 hours now, and the sourdough starter doubled in size, and then it started falling back, and This is how far it's gotten. It's almost back to the original level, but it did fine with the lower amount of feeding. It looks very similar to how it has been looking for the previous few days, and it still smells like nail polish remover. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to feed this. It is now day 131 for this einkorn flour sourdough starter. I'm in the middle of editing this video, and I just realized that I kind of stopped filming on day 14. I guess life got really busy and crazy, and I forgot to continue filming the journey of this sourdough starter. So I just wanted to film this now and recap everything that has happened since day 14. When I started the sourdough starter, it was September 1st. So we still had really warm weather, still really hot, and sourdough starter will rise faster in warmer weather. And as the weather got progressively cooler through the fall and now the winter, it's taking a lot longer to rise than it did previously when the weather's warmer. But that's just how sourdough starter behaves. So what I have on top of this jar is a little temperature sensor. Right now it says it is 68.9 degrees where this jar is, and it's 24% humidity. And I found that's very helpful to keep that there because it does take longer for the sourdough starter to rise and peak in cooler temperatures. And of course, this is an einkorn flour sourdough starter, so it does behave differently than a regular flour sourdough starter. What I have found is that einkorn flour in general tends to take a bit longer to rise, and it also usually doesn't rise as high as like the standard flours do. And I also adjusted how much I've been feeding this. So when I started this out, I was doing like a 1-to-2 ratio, which was 25 grams of starter, 50 grams of water, and 50 grams of flour. And then I was doing 25 grams of starter, 50 grams of water, and 55 grams of flour. And then I took the water and flour down to 40 grams each. And what I found works really well, and what I've been doing pretty much consistently, is 25 grams of starter, 35 grams of water, and 45 grams of flour. And that has been working out really well. So I've just been continuing that. Now, I have not been feeding it on a daily basis. In the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I'm following the instructions of Sourdough Journey, which is a wonderful channel. I definitely suggest you check that out. He also has a wonderful Instagram if you want to check that out also. And his website really has great resources, so definitely download his printed materials. They're free to download, and they give complete instructions on how to successfully start a sourdough starter. So what I've been doing instead of feeding it on a 24-hour schedule is watching the starter and reading the starter. So I've gotten to the point where I just glance at it when I'm in the kitchen, and I take note of when I think it is peaking. And then after it peaks, I let it fall for a while, and then I feed it before it gets all the way down to the bottom. And that's been working really well for me. And now that the weather is cold, I mean, sometimes it takes like 2 days for it to reach a peak, and then I'll let it go another day or two before I feed it. So sometimes I'm going 3 or 4 days between feedings, and I've had no problems with that at all. Like around Christmas and New Year's, when I wasn't home for a few days at a time, I had no problems with it, and it's still surviving, and it's still doing really great. It's much better to read a starter once you understand the different phases that it goes through than just feeding it on a set schedule, because you can really mess up the starter if you're not feeding it like at the right times. Like if I was feeding this every 24 hours, I would be messing it up because I would be feeding it before it actually peaked, because now it's so slow because of the winter time. But anyway, I just wanted to make this video because I have had several people ask me about the starter, and also because I had so many failed attempts at making a successful starter. This was the first time that it really worked, and all the credit goes to Sourdough Journey and all of the work and the research and the teachings that he has been doing with regards to sourdough starter. So definitely go check him out. And since he does not have any content specifically using this einkorn flour, I hope this video was helpful for you. What I've learned is that when using einkorn flour, you should use about 30% less water, which is how I ended up bringing the amount of water that I fed to it down to 35. If you take 70% of 50, that's 35. So those are my conclusions. If you have your own einkorn sourdough starter, please leave a comment below and let me know what kind of feeding schedule works for you and what kind of feeding ratio works for you. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.